Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this lecture, we will discuss the internal features of the hypothalamus, which is an important part of the diencephalon. Now, hypothalamus has a complex neuroendocrine structure. Complex neuroglandular structure. Hypothalamus is the endocrine engine of the body. It is the real endocrine engine of the body, as it controls the secretion of most important hormones of the body. It maintains body homeostasis. Via various systems like the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system of the body. Now, what are the parts of the hypothalamus? As explained in our previous lecture pertaining to the external features of the hypothalamus, briefly we will talk about different parts of hypothalamus. The inferior part of lateral wall of the third ventricle. Second, structures in the anterior part of floor of third ventricle. And number 3, structures in the posterior part of floor of third ventricle. Now, structure in the anteroinferior part of the lateral wall of the ventricle comprise of different hypothalamic nuclei. Now, structures in the anterior half of the floor of the third ventricle are different. For example, optic chiasma, then tuber cinereum, infundibulum, and pars nervosa of pituitary gland. structure in the anterior half of the floor of the fourth ventricle. Then structure in the posterior half of the floor of the ventricle is the subthalamic tegmental region. So these are different structures which are considered as part of the hypothalamus. Now the various hypothalamic nuclei in the antero-inferior part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So there are several hypothalamic nuclei in this region. These are crowded and are overlapping each other. Now to describe the hypothalamic nuclei in the antero-inferior wall of the antero-inferior part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle, we divide into zones. So hypothalamic nuclei disposed in the form of zones. The hypothalamic nuclei we divide into two major zones. Number one, medial zone. Hypothalamic nuclei. And number two, lateral zone. Hypothalamic nuclei. The medial zone of hypothalamic nuclei is further divided into anterior region, middle or tubular region, and posterior region. Nuclei. Now a section to the brain. You can see the cut section of the corpus callosum, then fornix, septum pellucidum, anteriorly this is anterior commissure, below it is the lamina terminalis, then optic chiasma, optic tract, part of the optic tract, then tuber cinereum, infundibulum, and pituitary gland. Behind tuber cinereum are mammillary bodies. And longitudinal section through the midbrain. Epipinal recess, pineal recess, then pineal body stalk, pineal body, then posterior commissure. This is lateral wall of the third ventricle. Here is hypothalamic sulcus. Above and behind is the thalamus. And below in front of hypothalamus is the below in front of the hypothalamic sulcus is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamic nuclei disposed in zones. As I told you, we divide them into medial zone and lateral zone. The medial zone further divided into anterior region. Then middle region, and posterior region. Now there are many nuclei crowded in these three regions of the middle zone of the hypothalamus. And suppose this is optic chiasma. And tuber cinereum, infundibulum. And pituitary gland. Mammillary body. Midbrain. His above the optic chiasma is lamina terminalis, and this is posterior commissure. Here is the hypothalamic sulcus, and this is the hypothalamus, where there are different nuclei divided into lateral and medial zone, and medial zone is further divided into anterior, middle, and posterior region. Now there are different nuclei, as I told you. Above the optic tract is the supraoptic nucleus. So in the anterior region, supraoptic nucleus. Then above the optic chiasma, suprachiasmatic nucleus. Then in front of it is preoptic nucleus. Suprachiasmatic nucleus. Then preoptic nucleus. Then parallel to the lamina terminalis, paraventricular nucleus. Then above the supraoptic nucleus is the anterior nucleus. So these are different nuclei in the anterior region of medial zone of the hypothalamus. Then in the middle region of medial zone of the hypothalamus is the dorsomedial nucleus. Ventromedial nucleus. And arcuate nuclei. These are the nuclei in the middle region of the medial zone. So middle region nuclei. Dorsomedial nucleus. Dorsoventral nucleus. Dorsomedial, ventromedial, not dorsal. Ventromedial nucleus. Ventromedial nucleus. Then arcuate nuclei. These are the nuclei in the middle region of the medial zone of the hypothalamus. Arcuate nucleus, also known as infundibular nucleus. Then the posterior region of the medial zone of the hypothalamus is posterior nucleus and lateral nucleus. Posterior nucleus and lateral nucleus. Then nuclei of the mammillary body. In the posterior region, lateral nucleus, posterior nucleus, and mammillary body nuclei. These are in the posterior region of the medial zone. So, hypothalamic nuclei in the medial zone of the hypothalamus. Next is the hypothalamic nuclei located in the lateral zone of the hypothalamus. Here is satiety center. Here is a nucleus having diffuse neurons. So this is how we can describe the hypothalamic nuclei in the form of different zones, two major zones, medial zone and lateral zone. The medial zone hypothalamic nuclei are further divided nuclei in the anterior region, in the middle region, and in the posterior region. In the anterior region, we have the supraoptic nucleus, suprachiasmatic nucleus, preoptic nucleus, anterior nucleus, and paraventricular nucleus. This is preoptic nucleus. These are nuclei in the anterior region of the medial zone. The paraventricular nucleus, then the anterior nucleus, preoptic, suprachiasmatic, and supraoptic nucleus. Next, the middle region of the medial zone. Here we have dorsomedial nucleus, ventromedial nucleus, and arcuate or infundibular nuclei in the middle region. Then in the posterior region of the medial zone is the posterior nucleus, the lateral nucleus, and nuclei of the mammillary body. Now I have divided the hypothalamic nuclei in rows, which are simple and easy for you to remember these nuclei. So one way of classification of the hypothalamic nuclei are in the form of zones. The other method which I have adopted is the hypothalamic nuclei disposed in rows. So we divide them into anterior row nuclei, middle row, and nuclei in the posterior row. So nuclei disposed in rows. Anterior row nuclei. Middle row nuclei. Posterior row nuclei. So from before backward, anterior row, middle row, and posterior row. Then hypothalamus, we have medial part and lateral part. Medial part. And lateral part of hypothalamus. What are the nuclei? Arranged in these rows, in the medial part and lateral part of the hypothalamus. Now, because this is the medial side of the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus in the anteroinferior part of the lateral or the third ventricle. So because this is forming part of the cavity of the third ventricle, therefore it is covered by ependyma. Now on the medial side, this is ependyma. Now, what are the nuclei in the anterior row of the hypothalamus? Now these are nuclei in the anterior row of the hypothalamus, medial side and lateral side. This is preoptic nucleus. This is suprachiasmatic nucleus. Supraoptic nucleus. This is paraventricular nucleus. And this is anterior nucleus. So in the anterior row of the hypothalamus, there is a supraoptic nucleus, then suprachiasmatic nucleus, then preoptic nucleus, paraventricular nucleus, and the anterior nucleus. These nuclei lie above the level of above the optic chiasma and optic tract. Now in this figure we can see this is optic chiasma and optic tract, and this is the hypothalamus where there are several nuclei. So just above the level of optic chiasma and optic tract, these nuclei are located. So this is anterior row. This is the part of the hypothalamus where anterior row nuclei are present. So above the optic tract, supraoptic nucleus, above the optic chiasma, suprachiasmatic nucleus. Then in front of the suprachiasmatic nucleus is the preoptic nucleus. Then above it, just adjacent to the lamina terminalis, is the paraventricular nucleus, and behind it is the anterior nucleus. So these are different nuclei of the anterior row of the hypothalamus. And all these nuclei are located above the optic chiasma and optic tract. Then what are the nuclei in the middle row? Middle row nuclei. This is dorsomedial nucleus. This is ventromedial nucleus. And here is arcuate nucleus. Also known as the infundibulous nucleus. So these are the nuclei in the middle row of hypothalamus. Dorsomedial nucleus above, ventromedial nucleus below, and then on the lateral side is the arcuate nucleus. Now these nuclei lie above the level of tuber cinereum. Above the level of tuber cinereum. Now here in this diagram you can see this is tuber cinereum, infundibulum, pituitary gland. So above the level is the middle row. Middle row nuclei located above the level of tuber cinereum. Now, what are these nuclei? The ventromedial nucleus below, dorsomedial nucleus above, and then on the lateral side is the arcuate nucleus. These are the three nuclei: the ventromedial, dorsomedial, and arcuate nucleus. Next, come to the posterior nuclei. Posterior nucleus. And lateral nucleus. And nuclei of the mammillary bodies. posterior nucleus. This is lateral nucleus. And these are mammillary bodies, nuclei of the mammillary body. So in the posterior row, this is posterior nucleus, medially located, lateral nucleus, laterally located, and there are nuclei of the mammillary body. In each mammillary body, there are two nuclei, one lateral and one medial. So in this way, the posterior row, it lies above the level of mammillary body. Posterior row nuclei. This is a mammillary body. So posterior row nuclei are located in this region, above the level of mammillary body. And there is a posterior nucleus, there is a lateral nucleus, and nuclei of the mammillary body. In this way, I have divided the hypothalamic nuclei into rows. Anterior row nuclei located above the optic tract and optic chiasma. Then middle row nuclei located above the level of tuber cinereum. And the posterior row nuclei located above the level of mammillary body. So anterior, middle, and posterior rows, and these are different nuclei in these rows. Now here, between the medial part and lateral part, there is a bundle of myelinated nerve fibers, white matter. Bundle of myelinated nerve fibers traverses between the lateral part and medial part of the hypothalamus. Medial part, lateral part, and these are bundle of myelinated nerve fibers. Now, what are these fibers? These fibers comprise of myelinated nerve fibers, so it is white matter traversing the hypothalamus. And these fibers, what are these fibers? That is, nerve fibers are the column of fornix. Column of fornix. Number 2, mammillothalamic. Mammillothalamic tract, and number 3, fasciculus retroflexus. Fasciculus retroflexus. Fasciculus retroflexus. So bundle of nerve fibers which are myelinated traverses through the hypothalamus between medially located and laterally located nuclei. These bundle of myelinated fibers comprise of fibers of the column of fornix, then fibers of the mammillothalamic tract, and another tract known as the fasciculus retroflexus. Thus, this band of white matter traverses to the hypothalamus, just like the internal medullary lamina passing through the thalamus. Now, the medial side is the ependymal lining of the third ventricle. So here again, between hypothalamic nuclei and ependymal lining, there is another bundle of myelinated nerve fibers. Known as the periventricular fibers. Periventricular fibers. Periventricular fibers. Traversing through the hypothalamus between the hypothalamic nuclei and the ependymal lining of the third ventricle, periventricular fibers. So these were the nuclei of the hypothalamus. Number one, these were divided into zones, lateral zone and medial zone. In the lateral zone, there is a center called satiety center, which is comprising of a nucleus having several disposed neurons. And then the medial zone, which is further divided into the anterior region, middle region, and posterior region, and there are different nuclei in these three regions. And the other way of describing these hypothalamic nuclei is defined by myself. As compared to this, it is more easy to memorize and remember these, and I have divided these hypothalamic nuclei into three rows from before backward: anterior row nuclei, then the middle row nuclei, and the posterior row nuclei. In the posterior, the anterior row nuclei, it lie above the level of optic chiasma and optic tract here, adjacent to the lamina terminalis. Then the middle row nuclei, these are located above the tuber cinerum, above the level of tuber cinerum. Here are the middle row nuclei of the hypothalamus. And then the posterior row is above the level of mammillary body. Therefore, if you know these structures in the floor of the third ventricle from before backwards, optic chiasma and the optic tract, you can easily name the nuclei supraoptic, suprachiasmatic, preoptic, and here is paraventricular anterior nucleus. Then behind it, you know there is tuber cinerum, infundibulum pituitary. So the nuclei above the tuber cinerum are dorsomedial, ventromedial, and the arcuate nuclei. Then the nuclei above the level of mammillary body, lateral nucleus, posterior nucleus, and also nuclei of the mammillary body. So this is how we describe the different nuclei of the hypothalamus. Thank you very much.